This factory was raided by the police, but what they were producing inside will make your hair stand on end. Cecile had always lived a quiet, peaceful life in her countryside home, where the mornings smelled of fresh dew and the evenings were painted in golden hues. That was until the factory arrived. At first, it seemed like any other industrial building, tall, gray, and unremarkable. But there was something unsettling about it. The factory gates remained locked during the day, its windows dark and lifeless, as if the building itself were asleep. Yet, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, the factory would come alive. Flickering lights illuminated the structure from within, shadows danced across the windows, and a strange, pungent stench filled the air, making Cecile's stomach churn every night. At first, she convinced herself it was nothing. Maybe it was just some odd production schedule. Maybe the smell was from chemicals or waste. But as the days stretched on, the factory's presence became more and more sinister. Unmarked trucks arrived in the dead of night, their cargo concealed beneath thick tarps. Men, dressed in dark clothing, moved swiftly as though they were avoiding being seen. And worst of all, there were sounds low, guttural noises that sometimes escalated into what she could only describe as muffled screams. One evening, unable to ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut any longer, Cecile decided to watch closely from her attic window. As the hours crawled past midnight, she finally saw something that sent ice through her veins. A man emerged from the factory, his clothes soaked in something thick and dark, his face pale as a ghost. He was clutching something that twitched and moved. In the dim moonlight, she could barely make out its shape, but as he passed under a flickering light, her heart nearly stopped. It was a hand, a human hand. Cecile stumbled backward, her breath shallow and erratic. Were they processing people inside that factory? The thought alone made her skin crawl. Without a second thought, she grabbed her phone and dialed the police. Her voice trembled as she relayed what she had seen, half expecting them to dismiss her as delusional. But the urgency in the officer's tone told her otherwise. Within minutes, sirens pierced the still night air. Police cars screeched to a halt outside the factory gates, their flashing lights casting eerie red and blue reflections on the cold, steel walls. Officers stormed in, weapons drawn. Cecile held her breath, watching intently, but what happened next was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. The moment the officers stepped inside, an ear-piercing scream echoed through the night, then another and another. Some officers stumbled back out almost immediately, their faces contorted in horror, their hands trembling as they fumbled for their radios. Others remained frozen, unable to move as they took in the nightmarish scene before them. And then, the factory's overhead lights flickered to life, revealing what had been hidden in the shadows. Rows of metallic tables lined the factory floor, each one occupied by something that barely resembled a human. Bodies, if they could still be called, that were strapped down, their skin stretched and patched together like grotesque dolls. Some still twitched, their eyes darting around wildly, pleading for help. Limbs hung from meat hooks, stitched together in unnatural ways, like some horrific experiment gone terribly wrong. Jars of organs sat on steel shelves, labeled with names instead of numbers. The factory was not producing goods, it was assembling people. One officer staggered to the side and vomited, his partner gripping his shoulder, trying to steady himself. "What the hell is this place?" someone gasped. A man in a blood-stained lab coat emerged from the shadows, his face disturbingly calm. "You weren't supposed to see this," he murmured, tilting his head. Cecile, still watching from her window, clamped a hand over her mouth, suppressing a scream. She had thought the police would put an end to this nightmare, but as the doctor took a step closer to the officers with an eerie smile, she realized the real horror had only just begun. The police officers stood frozen, their bodies caught between fear and duty. The man in the blood-stained lab coat, tall, gaunt, with an unsettling calmness, slowly adjusted his surgical gloves. The overhead lights flickered, casting grotesque shadows on the factory's steel walls. "You weren't supposed to see this," he repeated, his voice eerily soft. "But now that you have, well, we'll have to make arrangements." Before anyone could react, a deafening metallic clang echoed through the factory. The massive steel doors slammed shut behind them. The officers spun around, weapons raised, but the factory had become a sealed tomb. Then came the sound. A low, guttural moan rippled through the air, followed by the dragging of something heavy against the floor. The officers instinctively pointed their flashlights into the depths of the factory. The beams trembled as they illuminated the horrors lurking in the shadows. From behind the surgical tables, grotesque figures began to emerge. They were human, nor at least they had been. Their flesh was stitched together in unnatural ways, extra limbs sewn onto their torsos, their eyes vacant but alive. Some had mechanical enhancements, rusted metal plates bolted to their skulls, fingers replaced with crude surgical instruments. Their mouths twitched, attempting to form words, but only guttural groans escaped. The officers barely had time to react before the creatures lunged. Gunfire erupted. Muzzles flashed in the dim light, bullets tearing through the abominations, but they did not fall easily. Some staggered back but pressed forward again, as if pain no longer registered. One officer screamed as a clawed hand ripped into his vest, pulling him into the darkness. His cries were short-lived. Cecile, still watching in horror from her attic window, could hardly believe what she was seeing. The factory had turned into a war zone of flesh and metal. Blood splattered against the steel walls as officers fought desperately to escape. But it was no use, the factory had been designed to keep things in. And then something even worse happened. A deep, mechanical voice boomed through the factory's speakers. "Release Prototype 0, the lab-coated man's smile widened. He stepped back, pressing a button on the wall. A massive steel door groaned open at the far end of the factory. Silence fell. Even the stitched creatures froze, as if they too feared what was coming. Then heavy, thunderous footsteps echoed through the room. The officers turned their flashlights toward the darkened doorway. Their hands shaking, a figure stepped forward. It was nearly 8 feet tall, its body a horrifying fusion of human and machine. Its chest was covered in thick metal plating, its exposed skin pale and bruised, crisscrossed with fresh stitches. Wires and tubes snaked through its limbs, pulsing with an eerie blue glow. But its face was the worst part. It had no eyes, only deep, hollow sockets filled with darkness. Its mouth was stitched into a permanent, grotesque grin, and then it moved. Faster than anything that size should be capable of, it grabbed an officer and, with a sickening crunch, twisted his head completely around. The remaining officers opened fire, but the bullets barely phased it. It advanced, one by one, tearing through them like rag dolls. Cecile let out a strangled sob, stumbling away from the window. She had to run. She had to get out of here before a soft knock echoed through her house. Her breath hitched slowly. She turned toward the door. The knock came again, gentle, almost polite. She couldn't move. Her entire body was paralyzed with fear. Then a voice, calm, smooth, and far too close. "You've seen too much, Cecile." Her heart stopped. She wasn't alone anymore. Cecile stood frozen, every inch of her body screaming at her to run, but she couldn't. The voice outside her door was to calm, to knowing. "You've seen too much, Cecile." A slow, deliberate twist of the doorknob sent her into motion. She stumbled back, heart hammering against her ribs. The door creaked open just a fraction, enough for her to see a single, gloved hand resting against the wood. The hand of the man in the blood-stained lab coat. "Let me in, Cecile," he said, his voice dripping with eerie politeness. "We need to talk." Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. She turned and bolted for the back door, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. But just as her fingers curled around the handle slam, the front door burst open. She didn't dare look back. She yanked the back door open and sprinted into the night, her lungs burning with fear. The factory loomed in the distance, its lights still flickering, its walls still echoing with screams and gunfire. A cold wind whipped past her, carrying the stench of the factory, the nauseating smell of death, of rotting flesh and burning metal. But none of it compared to the sound that followed her footsteps, slow, steady, unhurried. The man was following her. She didn't stop. She ran past the tall grass, past the rusting fence that marked her property line, deeper into the fields. The ground was uneven, filled with holes and rocks, but she didn't care. She had to get as far away from that factory as possible. Then silence, the footsteps had stopped. She dared a glance over her shoulder. Nothing, the man was gone. Her legs trembled as she slowed, gasping for air, trying to make sense of what was happening. Had he given up? No, something was wrong. The air fell to still. The factory was still visible in the distance, but the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars had vanished. The sirens had stopped, and then she heard it. A low, mechanical whirring from above. Her stomach twisted as she slowly looked up. Hanging in the sky, just above the treetops, was a massive mechanical drone, hulking, black, and watching her. The moment her eyes met its glowing red sensor, a blaring alarm sounded from the factory. A hunt had begun. Cecil turned and ran, but it was too late. The ground beneath her trembled. The distant roar of something enormous shook the night air. From the depths of the factory, hidden doors slid open, and out came them. Not just one, not just prototype zero, dozens. Creatures of metal and flesh, stitched together from stolen bodies, outfitted with experimental enhancements. Their glowing eyes locked onto her, and in eerie unison, they let out an inhuman, distorted wail. The chase was on. She had no choice. She ran deeper into the countryside, her breath ragged, her mind screaming at her to keep moving. But something told her she wouldn't make it out alive. The factory had seen her, and it didn't let people go. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more inspiring content.